What if I told you that the entire modern financial matrix was not a natural evolution of global free market economics, but a highly calculated architecture designed in a remote hotel room to permanently cement the supremacy of a single sovereign empire? Welcome to money's hidden past. Rich people lied. We fact-checked today. We are stripping down the Bretton Woods Agreement and exposing the exact moment the global economy was captured. When traditional historians discuss the end of the Second World War, they focus entirely on the physical surrender of the Axis powers and on the military treaties signed on the decks of battleships, ignoring the silent financial coup executed in the mountains of New Hampshire. In the summer of 1944, the global economy lay in absolute ruins. The industrial manufacturing bases of Europe and Asia were reduced to ash. The legacy empires were functionally bankrupt and desperate for capital, while the United States emerged entirely untouched by the physical destruction. The American government possessed an unprecedented geopolitical advantage. They held absolute monopoly over the global manufacturing supply chain, and they systematically accumulated 2/3 of the entire physical gold supply on Earth, giving them the ultimate financial leverage to dictate the future of human commerce. Delegates from 44 sovereign nations traveled to the Mount Washington Hotel, believing they were participating in a collaborative international financial summit designed to rebuild the devastated global economy and prevent future currency wars. But the summit was essentially a diplomatic illusion, masking a unilateral mandate. The negotiations immediately collapsed into a brutal intellectual boxing match between two specific men representing the shifting balance of global power. John Maynard Keynes represented the decaying and heavily indebted British Empire, while Harry Dexter White represented the rising and untouchable American hegemon. Keynes recognized the structural danger of allowing one nation to control the money. He proposed the creation of a completely neutral international reserve currency, a supranational unit of account officially named the Bancor, designed to prevent any single sovereign state from weaponizing global trade. Keynes understood that a unipolar currency creates an inherent trade imbalance. He warned that the reserve nation would eventually consume the physical exports of the world while exporting absolutely nothing but paper inflation. In return, a structural paradox that economists later defined as the Triffin dilemma. White completely ignored these long-term structural warnings, focusing entirely on cementing the immediate geopolitical advantage of the Treasury, ensuring that the financial power of the British Empire was permanently buried and crowning Wall Street as the undisputed center of global commerce. White and the American delegation flatly rejected the neutral proposal. They knew they held the physical gold and the industrial leverage, and they forcefully demanded that the United States dollar become the absolute center dictating the terms of surrender to the Allied nations who desperately needed loans. The architecture of the agreement relied on a simple but devastating mechanical peg. The United States Treasury officially fixed the value of the dollar to gold, guaranteeing international convertibility at exactly $35 per ounce, providing the devastated globe with an anchor of absolute stability. But the trap was hidden in the secondary mechanism. The delegates agreed that every other sovereign currency on Earth would completely abandon their independent gold standards and strictly peg their national money directly to the United States dollar. This single mathematical decision transformed the global financial hierarchy. It forced the central banks of every sovereign nation to hold massive reserves of dollars, creating a permanent artificial international demand for American paper currency, and effectively making the dollar equivalent to physical gold to enforce the rules of this brand new financial architecture. The delegates established two massive international institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which eventually evolved into the modern World Bank. These institutions were publicly marketed as global benevolent charities, designed to provide emergency liquidity to struggling nations and finance the physical reconstruction of the devastated European infrastructure. But they structurally operated as the financial enforcers of the American empire. They offered massive dollar-denominated loans to the developing world, but the capital always carried highly restrictive structural adjustment conditions, forcing the borrowing nations to privatize their public utilities and permanently open their domestic resource markets to Western corporate extraction. The Bretton Woods system functioned perfectly for nearly 2 decades, facilitating an unprecedented era of global industrial expansion and allowing the American empire to export its domestic inflation abroad, while the working class enjoyed the highest standard of living in human history. But the mechanical integrity of the entire system relied on a singular promise: the absolute guarantee that the Federal Reserve would maintain the physical gold ratio and never print more paper dollars than the Treasury held in actual metal, a promise the political elite inevitably and predictably broke. During the 1960s, the American empire aggressively expanded its footprint, launching a massive and incredibly expensive military conflict in Vietnam, while simultaneously funding sweeping domestic welfare programs across the nation, requiring an unprecedented expansion of the federal budget rather than raising domestic taxes to fund the guns and the butter. The government silently accelerated the printing presses, flooding the global economy with billions of unbacked paper dollars and mathematically fracturing the $35 gold ratio. The international community recognized the mathematical discrepancy. They calculated the volume of physical gold resting inside Fort Knox and realized it could not possibly cover the massive supply of offshore dollars, triggering a quiet panic among the European central banks. The sovereign nation of France, led by Charles de Gaulle, called the bluff. He refused to hold the depreciating American paper currency and ordered the French Navy to sail warships directly across the Atlantic Ocean, demanding the United States Treasury physically load the gold onto the vessels. This aggressive repatriation ignited a massive run on the American gold reserves as foreign nations rushed to exchange their surplus dollars for physical metal bleeding. The sovereign treasury dry and pushing the empire to the brink of default, proving that structural economic realities always overpower diplomatic agreements. The executives in Washington realized they could not honor the Bretton Woods Agreement. They lacked the physical gold required to satisfy the international demand and facing an absolute systemic collapse of the global financial order. They executed the ultimate sovereign default. On the evening of August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon interrupted standard television broadcasting and officially directed the Treasury to suspend the convertibility of the dollar, unilaterally breaking the foundational promise of the New Hampshire summit. He assured the terrified global public that the suspension was entirely temporary, a brief structural adjustment necessary to combat currency speculators. But the gold window never reopened, and the anchor tying human money to physical thermodynamic reality was permanently severed. The Nixon shock destroyed the architecture of the Bretton Woods Agreement, plunging the entire planet into an uncharted era of unbacked fiat currency, where sovereign governments no longer required physical commodities to issue money. They simply required the absolute compliance of their domestic working class. When the gold window slammed shut, the empire required a new mechanism to guarantee the global demand for their newly unbacked paper currency. They dispatched diplomats to the deserts of Saudi Arabia and forged a brand new financial architecture based on energy. The sovereign oil producers agreed to price their crude exclusively in dollars and invest their massive surplus capital directly into United States Treasury bonds, creating the petrodollar recycling system that replaced the gold standard and forcing the entire globe to continue holding the currency to purchase fuel without the structural restraint of the gold-peg central banks, gained the infinite power to manipulate the money supply, launching a 50-year era of permanent structural inflation that systematically steals the purchasing power of the global population. The transition from commodity money to fiat currency completely destroyed the ability of the working class to save their capital, forcing ordinary citizens to blindly throw their wages into the stock market just to prevent the invisible tax of inflation from melting their purchasing power. The global institutions established in the mountains of New Hampshire, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank did not disappear when the underlying gold standard collapsed. They simply adapted their extraction models to the new fiat reality. They continued to enforce dollar hegemony across the global south, utilizing the petrodollar system to maintain international demand for the currency and ensuring the unipolar financial order survived the death of the gold peg, securing the supremacy of the empire for another half-century when you trace the origins of modern wealth inequality and analyze the mechanical forces driving the destruction of the middle class. You always arrive back at the structural shift initiated in 1944 and the ultimate default executed in 1971. The architects of the modern economy did not design a fair market. They designed a proprietary financial network that benefits the issuer, forcing the rest of the globe to utilize a currency they cannot control, and taxing the international community through the silent mechanism of inflation. You must analyze the global economy through the lens of monetary history, recognizing that international summits and diplomatic treaties are rarely designed to foster global cooperation and unity. They are designed to formalize the mathematical rules of resource extraction. The legacy of the Bretton Woods Agreement surrounds you every single day. It dictates the yield on your savings account and the cost of your groceries. It determines the geopolitical leverage of your sovereign government, and it proves that whoever controls the ledger completely controls the world. If this breakdown of the Bretton Woods Agreement and the dark math behind the global reserve currency fired you up about taking total control of your permanent financial architecture, then do me a favor. Right now, smash that like button to let the algorithm know this factual historical conversation matters. Share this video with every friend and family member who needs to understand how the real financial world operates. Let us keep exposing the true mechanics of wealth and power. I will catch you in the next one, where we break down the next hidden chapter in the long history of money and corporate authority. Until then, stay informed, stay skeptical. And remember that the paper currency in your wallet is simply the lingering ghost of an international treaty that died decades ago.